On the morning of October 6, 1989, the quiet town of Noel, Missouri, awoke to a crime unlike anything in its history. At the State Bank of Noel, cashier Pauline Coonrod arrived for work expecting a routine day. Instead, she found the front doors already unlocked. Inside, the building was silent. No employees were present. As she walked further in, her eyes fell on the vault. The heavy steel door stood wide open. Drawers had been disturbed. Money was gone. Thousands of dollars had been taken, including hundreds of pounds of coins. The bank's security camera had been spray painted and destroyed with gunfire. And the bank's president, Dan Short, was nowhere to be found. Had he been taken against his will? Had he staged the robbery himself? Or was something far more sinister hidden beneath the surface?
For federal agents, the Noel bank robbery became an intricate case in modern forensics and dogged determination.
The morning began like any other in the small town of Noel, Missouri. Tucked away in the southwest corner of the state, Noel was a community of just over 1,200 people. Its residents valued the quiet pace of life. Poultry plants, small businesses, and summer tourism along the river made up most of the local economy. It was a town where people left their doors unlocked, where news traveled fast, and where crime was rare. But on this morning, the State Bank of Noel would become the scene of a crime that would shatter that peace forever. At around 8 o'clock, cashier Pauline Coonrod arrived at the bank. Her first task each morning was routine: unlock the front doors and prepare for business. As she approached the entrance, she noticed something unusual. The doors were already unlocked. At first, she thought that her boss, Bank President Dan Short, had come in early. But as she stepped inside, the building was eerily silent. Coonrod walked through the lobby and into the offices. There was no sign of Short, no sign of any other employees. Then she turned toward the vault. The heavy steel doors stood open. Inside, drawers were disturbed and money was missing. Within minutes, she realized the bank had been robbed. Police were called immediately, and the McDonald County Sheriff's Department secured the building. Because the bank was federally insured by the FDIC, the FBI was also notified. Agents from the Joplin field office were dispatched. The entire building was photographed, every surface dusted for prints, and the vault examined in detail. One of the first discoveries stood out. The bank's security camera, mounted near the ceiling, had been disabled. The lens was spray-painted black, and the housing was shattered by gunfire. Investigators collected several spent casings on the floor beneath it. They were .45 caliber pistols. Whoever had committed the robbery had taken deliberate steps to prevent their crime from being recorded. Attention turned to the vault. Bank records showed that more than $71,000 had been stolen. But the breakdown of what was missing puzzled investigators. The thieves had taken over 300 pounds of coins, quarters, dimes, and nickels packed into canvas bags. Yet in an unlocked drawer nearby, they left behind more than $100,000 in bills. The selection made little sense. Coins were bulky, heavy, and difficult to transport without attracting attention. Bills were far easier to conceal and carry. Investigators wondered if the robbers had been rushed or if they had specific reasons for taking the coins. With no witnesses, no alarms triggered, and the cameras disabled, agents began to look at who could have opened the vault so easily. Only 4 bank employees had access when the time lock was not engaged. One of them was Bank President Dan Short. He was also the only employee who had failed to report to work that morning. This fact placed Short at the center of the investigation. Bank Vice President Mark Allman told investigators that Short had intended to work late the night before. The vault's time lock, a device designed to prevent entry outside certain hours, had not been engaged. According to Allman, Short had a habit of leaving the vault on standby if he planned to return later in the evening. That detail raised the possibility that Short himself had re-entered the bank during the night, but by morning, he was gone. Sheriff's deputies drove to Short's home in Arkansas, just across the Missouri border. The house appeared still and quiet. His red pickup truck was missing. Inside, they found several details that suggested something was wrong. In the kitchen, a trash can had been overturned. In the bedroom, Short's glasses were still on the nightstand. He never went anywhere without them. To investigators, the scene suggested that he had left suddenly, possibly under duress. A few hours later, a call came in from an employee at Sibley Manufacturing, a factory just outside town. A red pickup truck had been abandoned in the parking lot. It was registered to Dan Short. Agents examined the vehicle. In the bed, they found coin wrappers, the same kind used by the State Bank of Noel. The truck was dusted for fingerprints. Only Short's were identified. The discovery deepened the mystery. Had Short been abducted and forced to help the robbers? Or had he himself stolen the money and staged his own disappearance? Theories diverged, but one fact was clear. Short was missing. Investigators began piecing together a timeline. A neighbor of Short, Carol Dryden, reported that around 2 o'clock in the morning she had seen headlights pulling into his driveway. 15 to 20 minutes later, she saw vehicles leaving. Separately, a local truck driver, Buddy Mills, was returning home from work at around 3 o'clock in the morning. On the road out of Noel, he encountered a small convoy of vehicles leaving town. One of them was a red pickup truck that matched Short's. With it were a two-tone van and a dark-colored truck. Mills noted that one of the vehicles followed him for a distance before turning off toward the Arkansas border. The witness statements aligned to suggest that sometime between 2 and 3 a.m., multiple vehicles arrived at Short's home and later departed Noel with his truck among them. Within hours, the bank was found robbed and Short was gone. The first day of the investigation closed with no sign of the missing banker. Theories were split. If Short was involved, he could have absconded with the money. But if he was a victim, his life was in danger. Agents placed stops on his credit cards, monitored airports, and checked rental car companies. But no trace of him appeared. The FBI could not ignore the possibility that the bank president himself had planned the theft. But they also knew that robberies of this kind often ended in violence. Either way, the search for Dan Short had become the priority. In the days that followed, search efforts expanded. Teams of deputies and federal agents combed the countryside on foot, in vehicles, and by helicopter. Planes circled overhead, scanning roads, fields, and riverbanks. The search began from the location where Short's truck was found and moved outward in concentric circles, hoping to locate any trace of the missing banker. Despite the effort, the days passed with no results. There was no sign of Short alive or dead. The community of Noel was left in shock. Their bank had been robbed, their president was missing, and answers were nowhere in sight. 5 days later, those answers would begin to surface in the most gruesome way imaginable. On the morning of October 11th, the case took a darker turn. At Grand Lake, Oklahoma, just over the state line, 2 fishermen motored across the water in search of a good spot to drop their lines. The lake was a popular destination for recreation, a place where families boated and anglers cast for bass. But that morning, the calm waters concealed a horrifying secret. As the fishermen approached a shaded area near Cowskin Bridge, they noticed something unusual floating just beneath the surface. At first it looked like a clump of weeds, but as they moved closer, the outline became clear. It was a human body. Sheriff's deputies from Delaware County, Oklahoma, responded to the scene. What they pulled from the water shocked even the most seasoned officers. The body was bound to a chair with heavy duct tape. Chains and a concrete block weighed it down. The remains were badly decomposed from days submerged in the lake. A wallet was found in the victim's back pocket. Inside was a driver's license identifying the man as 51-year-old Dan Short. The missing bank president had been found. The medical examiner confirmed the cause of death as drowning. The time of death was consistent with the morning of October 6th, the same day the robbery was discovered. Investigators studied the apparatus used to kill him. Short had been strapped to a metal chair. his body secured with wide strips of duct tape. A heavy chain hoist was wrapped around the chair, attached to a concrete block designed to anchor him to the bottom of the lake. Whoever planned the murder had done so meticulously. The goal was clear. Dan Short was never meant to be found. But decomposition had other plans. After several days underwater, gases from bacterial activity inside the body built up and lifted the corpse to the surface. The weight of the chains and block should have kept it down, but with the pressure, the body surfaced, exposing the killer's crime to the world. The discovery of the murder scene shifted the investigation into a homicide. What had begun as a bank robbery was now a case of premeditated murder. The FBI and local law enforcement converged on Grand Lake. Special Agent Liddell Farley, a 19-year veteran, took command of the case. His task force preserved every element of the crime scene. The chair, chains, duct tape, and block were carefully photographed and collected as evidence. These items would be sent to the FBI laboratory in Washington, D.C. for detailed analysis. The brutality of the crime shook both investigators and the community. The fact that Short had been drowned while conscious, bound to a chair, and dropped 30 feet into the dark water was a chilling detail. It suggested ruthless determination by the perpetrators to silence their victim. The recovery of Short's body clarified one thing immediately. He had not been an accomplice. He had been a victim all along. For the FBI, the focus now shifted entirely to finding his killers. To generate leads, the FBI released photographs of the chair and chains to the public. They set up a hotline for tips. Within hours, calls began flooding in. Some were general theories. Others were specific suspicions about people in the area. One anonymous caller mentioned that two brothers, two men, had been seen with large amounts of change shortly after the robbery. This detail was significant because among the stolen money was more than 300 pounds of coins. In the days following, another development emerged. A local resident named Rowdy Foreman, while fishing with his children along the shore of Grand Lake, discovered two items that seemed out of place. One was a wooden dowel, the kind used as a brace on a chair. The other was a piece of duct tape. Having seen photographs of the murder apparatus in newspapers, Foreman suspected a connection. He preserved the items in plastic bags and turned them over to investigators. At the FBI laboratory, examiners compared the fisherman's finds to the chair and duct tape recovered with Short's body. The results were conclusive. The dowel matched the broken frame of the chair. The piece of duct tape, when examined under magnification, revealed fibers and torn edges that aligned perfectly with strips of tape from the chair. Even more importantly, the tape bore a clear latent fingerprint preserved in grease residue. Unlike sweat, which dissolves in water, the grease print had survived days of submersion. The print represented the first direct physical evidence against a suspect, but the laboratory still needed to match it to a known individual. Meanwhile, investigators expanded their search in the area surrounding Grand Lake. Witness canvassing continued in Noel and the nearby Arkansas border. Several locals described seeing vehicles near Short's home the night of the crime. One witness reported 3 vehicles leaving Noel around 3 in the morning. A red pickup truck matching Short's, a 2-tone van, and a dark-colored truck. This account aligned with earlier reports from Short's neighbor, who had seen headlights entering and leaving his driveway around 2 a.m. These sightings suggested that multiple individuals were involved. At least 3 vehicles were part of the convoy. This indicated more than one perpetrator and possibly a third accomplice who remained unidentified. Back at the FBI's command post, the case file grew rapidly. Agents charted every lead, every tip, and every witness statement. They now had a victim, a confirmed murder, and forensic evidence linking the crime scene to objects found nearby. But they still had no prime suspects. The death of Dan Short ignited fear across the community. For Noel, a town that prided itself on safety, the idea that someone had been kidnapped, forced to open his own bank, and then drowned in cold blood was unthinkable. Residents were frightened. Many were reluctant to cooperate with investigators, worried about the level of violence displayed in the crime. Some feared retaliation if they came forward. Despite this, tips continued to arrive. Every call was logged, every lead followed. By the end of the second week, investigators had compiled a list of more than 80 possible suspects. Some were quickly eliminated, others remained under quiet surveillance. Among them, the Agofsky brothers began to stand out. By early 1990, the FBI's investigation into the robbery of the State Bank of Noel and the murder of Dan Short had narrowed to two young men, Joe and Shannon Agofsky. Joe was 23, Shannon just 18. They lived with their mother in a modest home south of town. Locals described them as hot-headed troublemakers, but not the type of men suspected in a sophisticated bank robbery and cold-blooded murder. On paper, they had little. Neither held steady employment, yet their spending told a different story. Both had recently purchased cars outright with cash, and Shannon, barely out of high school, was moving money in ways investigators knew could not be explained by his inheritance. Their father had died in a plane crash years earlier, leaving the family an insurance settlement, but most of that money had long been depleted. The brothers had no legitimate source for the cash they were spending. Agents decided to confront them. In early interviews, both appeared calm and cooperative. Joe insisted that on the night of the robbery, he had been at his girlfriend's home 40 miles away. Shannon claimed he had stayed at his mother's house. Each alibi seemed rehearsed, but each provided a veneer of distance from the crime. When asked about weapons, Joe acknowledged owning two .45 caliber handguns, the same caliber used to disable the bank's security camera. He offered them up for testing, and Shannon showed investigators where they were kept. The weapons were fired and sent to the FBI laboratory. Days later, the results came back. Neither matched the casings recovered at the bank. The interviews were polite, the brothers cooperative, and the ballistics a dead end. For the moment, suspicion eased, but their unexplained cash and the tips tying them to large amounts of coins kept them in the spotlight. Meanwhile, developments from Grand Lake began to tighten the noose. 2 days after Dan Short's body was pulled from the water, fisherman Rowdy Foreman discovered fragments along the shoreline: a wooden dowel and a strip of duct tape. Laboratory examiners later confirmed the dowel matched the fracture of the chair that held Short, and the tape bore adhesive and fiber striations that matched the murder device. More importantly, the tape carried a clear fingerprint in grease. Against all odds, the print had survived days underwater. It was the most promising piece of evidence yet. Another lead soon added weight. A local man, Wayne Boutin, reported that a chain hoist had been stolen from him. He described distinctive damage to the pulley wheels and said he had last seen the device at the Agofsky residence. When investigators showed him photographs of the hoist recovered with Short's body, he identified it as his own. The murder weaponry, duct tape, chair, chain hoist, now pointed toward the Agofskys. Agents returned to question the family. Sheila, the brother's mother, claimed to know nothing about the hoist. She confirmed Shannon's alibi, saying he was home that night. Joe admitted he remembered seeing the hoist at the house, but denied knowing what happened to it. When asked for fingerprints, Joe cooperated immediately. Shannon hesitated, promising to provide them later, but failed to appear. His refusal raised suspicion further. By this time, the FBI had also traced their financial activity. Records showed Shannon had spent over $5,000 in cash after the robbery, and Joe nearly $19,000 in the following 16 months, all while unemployed. The contradiction between their means and their lifestyle was stark. Phone records began to unravel Joe's alibi. He had told investigators he was with his girlfriend the entire night of the crime, yet long-distance calls from his location to her home in the days surrounding the robbery proved otherwise. The story collapsed under scrutiny. As the financial inconsistencies mounted, investigators turned to the brothers' closest associate, Gant Sanders. A friend of Shannon's, he often stayed at their house. Questioned initially, Sanders denied involvement in the robbery or the murder. He had no alibi but remained firm in his denials. Investigators noted his loyalty, but could not place him at the crime. In December 1989, Shannon was asked to take a polygraph. Conducted in a motel room, the test measured his physiological responses as he denied any role in the robbery or murder. The examiner concluded he was deceptive. Though inadmissible in court, the results confirmed what agents already suspected: Shannon was lying. Meanwhile, forensic analysis progressed slowly. Joe's prints were compared to the one on the duct tape. They did not match. But examiners noted something unusual. The print bore strong resemblance to Joe's ridge patterns, enough to suggest it belonged to a sibling. That meant Shannon's fingerprints were critical. Despite repeated requests, he refused to provide them voluntarily. A subpoena was issued, and in early 1990, Shannon was compelled to give a full set. While results were pending, Sanders reemerged. In June 1990, he agreed to speak again, perhaps tired of suspicion or eager to protect himself. He maintained he had not participated in the bank robbery, but admitted to involvement in another crime with the brothers, a burglary in December 1989, where they stole rifles and transported them across state lines to sell in Arkansas. It was a federal violation. Sanders confessed, made a deal, and was placed on probation. Polygraphs cleared him of the bank case, but Sanders gave investigators more than a confession to burglary. He described conversations with the brothers before the Noel robbery in which they spoke of plans to abduct a banker, force him to open a vault, and kill him to eliminate a witness. One conversation, in particular, stood out. Joe suggested following a banker from Joplin, kidnapping him, and making him open the safe. At the time, Sanders dismissed it as talk. After Dan Short's murder, it sounded like a blueprint. By now, Shannon had been arrested on a firearms charge unrelated to the robbery. During a search of his car, agents discovered bags of nickels in the trunk. Though impossible to prove as bank property, their presence was a striking coincidence given the robbery's unusual focus on coins. From jail, Shannon called his brother and mother regularly. The conversations were recorded. In one call, Shannon asked Joe whether investigators could place him at the crime scene. Joe reassured him that they could not. For prosecutors, the exchange was damning. Then came the breakthrough. After weeks of comparison, FBI examiners confirmed that the fingerprint on the duct tape matched Shannon Agofsky. It was an exact ridge-for-ridge identification. The tape had been part of the apparatus that bound Dan Short to the chair and dragged him into Grand Lake. The link was irrefutable. With this evidence, prosecutors built their case. Against Shannon, they had direct forensic proof. Against Joe, they had the stolen hoist traced to his home, the collapse of his alibi, unexplained cash spending, and incriminating recorded calls. With Sanders' testimony about their earlier kidnapping plans, the brothers' blueprint for the crime was clear. By mid-1991, investigators had reconstructed the entire sequence. In the early hours of October 6, 1989, Joe and Shannon, along with at least one accomplice, drove to Dan Short's home. They forced him into their convoy, using his own truck and their mother's van. At the bank, they disabled the security camera with spray paint and gunfire. Short, under duress, opened the vault. The robbers hurriedly collected cash and coins, leaving behind over $100,000 in bills. They then drove south to Grand Lake. There, they bound Short to a chair, secured the stolen chain hoist and concrete block, and dropped him 30 feet into the water. In his final moments, the bank president drowned. 5 days later, decomposition brought his body back to the surface, carrying with it the evidence that would eventually destroy his killer's defenses. For the FBI, the print in grease on a strip of duct tape was the critical piece, resistant to water. It survived where the killers thought no trace could. That single fingerprint transformed the case from suspicion to certainty, and from investigation to indictment. By 1992, Both brothers were charged on federal counts of bank robbery, abduction, and firearms use. A state murder case against Shannon followed. The case was ready for trial. The evidence was presented systematically. Jurors were shown photographs of the vault, the broken security camera, and the recovered apparatus from Grand Lake. They heard from forensic examiners who explained how the duct tape fingerprint survived underwater, and how it matched Shannon beyond any doubt. They learned of the hoist stolen from Wayne Butane, seen last at the Agofsky home and later used to drown Dan Short. They saw the financial records that charted the brothers' sudden spending spree after the crime. Despite having no jobs, they heard Sanders explain how the brothers had talked of targeting a banker in almost the exact fashion that Dan Short was kidnapped. The combination of forensic evidence, financial anomalies, and corroborating testimony painted a complete picture. After deliberation, the jury returned guilty verdicts on all counts. Both brothers were convicted of armed bank robbery, abduction resulting in death, and firearms charges. But the federal convictions were not the end. Missouri prosecutors prepared their own case for state murder charges, focusing on Shannon. In that trial, prosecutors presented the same forensic evidence that had tied him to the duct tape. Witnesses again described the suspicious spending, the missing hoist, and the convoy of vehicles seen near Short's home. The case was clear. Shannon had personally handled the materials that killed Dan Short. The jury agreed. He was convicted of murder and sentenced to life without the possibility of parole. Joe's fate was sealed by the federal convictions, though the state did not secure a separate murder verdict against him. His role as co-conspirator left him imprisoned for life with no chance of release. The unidentified third accomplice, believed to have driven one of the vehicles, was never identified. His role remains a gap in the full account of the crime. By the mid-1990s, the Agofsky brothers had exhausted their appeals. They remain incarcerated, serving life sentences without parole. Sanders, for his cooperation, served probation for his firearms violation and returned quietly to civilian life. No charges were ever filed against Sheila Agofsky, their mother, despite suspicion that she had shielded her sons during questioning. The case of the State Bank of Noel is remembered as one of Missouri's most brutal and complex bank robberies, not for the amount stolen, but for the calculated cruelty inflicted on its victim.